Long before he became known as Saruman the White, or Curunír among the elves, he existed in a far more exalted and ethereal form. Saruman was not a mortal being, nor even an elf or dwarf. He was a Maia, a lesser spirit of divine origin, brought into existence by Eru Ilúvatar, before the shaping of the world itself. As a Maia, Saruman belonged to the same spiritual order as Sauron, Gandalf, and the Balrog of Moria, though each walked a vastly different path. The Maiar were not gods, but they were immortal, ageless, and powerful. They were meant to serve the greater powers known as the Valar, 14 mighty beings who governed Arda, the world itself. Among the Maiar, Saruman's original name was Curumo, and he was one of the wisest and most learned of his kind. He served Allure, the Vala of craftsmanship, knowledge, and the substance of the earth. Under Auleur's tutelage, Curumo grew fascinated with the secrets of matter, construction, and control, an interest that would echo darkly in his future. Allure himself was the creator of the dwarves and the forger of many great works, but his most famous pupil among the Maiar was not Curumo, it was Sauron, who also began as a servant of Allure before turning to darkness. The similarities in their early paths are not coincidental. Both were drawn to order, structure, and domination of the physical world. But whereas Sauron embraced domination through fear, Saruman would initially appear more subtle, more patient, at least at first. When the threat of Sauron's return began to grow in the Third Age of Middle-earth, the Valar saw that the free peoples needed guidance and help. They resolved to send 5 emissaries, known as the Istari, to act as spiritual mentors and guides. These would be Maiar, cloaked in the bodies of old men, deliberately limited in physical power, so they could not dominate by force. Their mission was to rally resistance, offer wisdom, and inspire hope, not to rule. Curumo was chosen first, and considered the greatest among the 5. He was tall, noble in bearing, and immensely intelligent. He was given the color white, to signify his rank and purity of purpose. Thus Curumo became Saruman the White, man of skill, as his name translates from the speech of men. In Quenya, the High Elvish tongue, he was called Curunír, meaning man of cunning devices. Both names would come to define him. The other 4 Istari were selected afterward. Among them were Mithrandir, whom the world would come to know as Gandalf, and Iwendil, later known as Radagast the Brown. 2 blue wizards also accompanied them into Middle-earth, Alatar and Palando, though their fates lie in obscurity, far to the east. Upon arriving in Middle-earth sometime around the year 1000 of the Third Age, Saruman traveled widely, studying the peoples, histories, and magic of the land. He gained renown among elves, men, and even dwarves for his wisdom, persuasive speech, and command over lore. At first he was cautious and faithful to his mission. He combated the rising shadows in the east and built alliances with the wise. But from the very beginning he held a subtle pride in being the first chosen, the chief among the Istari, and this pride would fester over the centuries. It wasn't long before Saruman became the head of the White Council, a powerful alliance of wise beings formed to combat the growing shadow of Sauron. Elrond, Galadriel, Gandalf, and others sat on this council, but Saruman was its leader. Galadriel had originally wanted Gandalf to lead, sensing his humility and deeper strength, but Gandalf refused the position. Saruman accepted instead, and his pride was soothed, at least temporarily. Yet even in those early years, seeds of doubt and ambition were already being sown. Saruman began to study the devices of the enemy, not just to understand Sauron, but perhaps to match or even surpass him. His fascination with the One Ring grew quietly, like a slow, creeping vine. He insisted that the ring was lost forever, trying to dissuade the council from actively searching for it. But in secret, he began to seek the ring for himself. This duplicity marks a critical turning point in Saruman's character, the divergence from Curumo the faithful Maia into Saruman the deceiver. His knowledge, once pure and enlightening, became tinted with manipulation. He used his eloquence and position to obscure his true intent. He built alliances, but only as a means to an end. In his mind, the others were pawns, or at best, lesser minds who lacked his clarity of vision. He set up residence in Orthanc, the Black Tower of Isengard, a relic from the days of Númenor, indestructible and ancient. At first a place of learning and contemplation, Orthanc slowly became a fortress. Saruman poured his intellect into machinery, alchemy, and genetic manipulation. He was recreating Auleur's gifts in his own image, building not for beauty or balance, but for dominance. Though Saruman still walked among the free peoples, he began withdrawing from them. His robes remained white, but his soul had already begun to fade into shadow. He began using a palantir, one of the seeing stones of old, and unknowingly, or perhaps willingly, made contact with Sauron, who was using another palantir from Barad-dûr. Through this connection, Saruman was drawn ever deeper into the web of the enemy. He believed he could master the power Sauron wielded, unaware that he was becoming ensnared. In truth, the fall of Saruman did not happen all at once. It was a long decline, rooted in vanity, sharpened by ambition, and sealed by self-deception. He believed himself immune to the very temptations he warned others against. He saw Gandalf as a rival and feared his growing influence. He began to resent the world for not recognizing his superiority, for not bowing to his designs. Slowly, subtly, his mission became twisted. He no longer sought to defeat Sauron for the sake of Middle-earth, he sought to replace him. Yet even in his descent, Saruman remained a figure of tragedy. His fall was not born of sudden corruption like Gollum's, nor was it imposed upon him like the Nazgûl. It was the product of choice, a slow surrender to pride and the belief that he knew better than the Valar, better than the Council, better than Gandalf. His descent was not into madness, but into a cold, calculating obsession with order, control, and power. Thus, Saruman's origins as Curunír the Maia, servant of Allure, and emissary of the Valar, stand in stark contrast to what he would become. He was meant to be a beacon in a time of darkness, a wise leader who could guide Middle-earth away from ruin. Instead, he became a mirror of the enemy he was sent to oppose, a cautionary tale of how even the wisest and most powerful can fall when they mistake their ambition for righteousness. Saruman's arrival in Middle-earth around the year 1000 of the Third Age marked the beginning of a new phase in the struggle against the Shadow. Though his divine origins as Curunír the Maia were hidden beneath the veil of a mortal form, he quickly rose to prominence among the wise, tall, commanding, and eloquent. Saruman embodied the dignity of his order. His deep knowledge of lore, his mastery of speech, and the aura of authority that followed him made him the natural leader of the Istari, at least in appearance. By the time the White Council was formed in TA 2463, Saruman had already established himself as one of the most learned and powerful beings in Middle-earth. The purpose of the White Council was simple in theory but daunting in practice: to counter the growing power of Sauron, who had begun to stir again in secret, gathering strength in the fortress of Dol Guldur. The Valar had sent the Istari to guide the peoples of Middle-earth in resisting this darkness, and the Council was to be their organized effort. The Council included some of the greatest minds and powers of the age: Elrond of Rivendell, bearer of one of the three elven rings; Galadriel of Lothlorien, one of the oldest and wisest of the Eldar; Círdan the Shipwright; and Gandalf the Grey, known to the elves as Mithrandir. Together they formed a fellowship of wisdom and strategy, yet it was Saruman who presided over them. Galadriel had initially wished Gandalf to lead the council. She sensed something deeper and more trustworthy in him: an absence of pride, a quiet strength that could not be corrupted. But Gandalf declined the offer. He was humble, always cautious of power and his own limitations. Saruman, on the other hand, accepted without hesitation. He believed he was the most qualified, the most learned, the most fit to lead, and in the eyes of many, he was. His white robes, his commanding intellect, and his confidence masked the early stirrings of pride that would become his downfall. As head of the White Council, Saruman began to exert tremendous influence over the affairs of the West. He presented himself as a noble steward of wisdom, a champion of Middle-earth against the lingering threat of Sauron. He spoke often of unity, strength, and the need for vigilance. He studied the ancient histories of the Rings of Power, delving into the craft of the elves and the corruption of the rings forged by Sauron. No other member of the council had such exhaustive knowledge of the enemy's past, and yet this very knowledge began to change him. Saruman's obsession with the rings, especially the One Ring, grew over decades. Though he feigned skepticism, telling the council that the ring had been lost forever, he privately began to search for it. He was certain that if he could find the One Ring first, he could master it, not to destroy it, but to wield it. He believed that the power which had corrupted Sauron could be bent to serve a better purpose under his own control. To Saruman, the ring was not a danger, it was an opportunity. This secret ambition created growing tension within the council, particularly with Gandalf. While Gandalf urged action against Dol Guldur, and suspected that the power behind it was indeed Sauron himself returned, Saruman urged patience. He claimed that Dol Guldur was likely the work of a lesser evil, that the council should not provoke unnecessary conflict. In reality, he was biding time, hoping to locate the One Ring before either Sauron or Gandalf could. Despite this inner conflict, Saruman continued to play the part of the noble wizard. He remained charismatic and highly respected. Many of the free peoples looked to him as a beacon of wisdom. He traveled between realms, consulted with kings, and maintained an appearance of impartiality. He even worked to distance himself from Radagast the Brown, whom he dismissed as a fool absorbed in beasts and plants. Saruman increasingly saw himself not as a servant of the Valar, but as a figure of supreme authority in his own right. During this time, Saruman also requested and was granted the keys to Orthanc, the great tower of Isengard. The tower had long stood unused. Its construction was a marvel of ancient Númenórean engineering, built of seamless black stone and impossible to damage or replicate. Saruman claimed he needed a place of study, a fortress from which to coordinate his works. The steward of Gondor, seeing no threat, consented. Saruman made Isengard his home and slowly began to transform it into his private kingdom. The Tower of Orthanc became more than a sanctuary of learning. It became a laboratory of control. Within its halls, Saruman amassed ancient scrolls, studied alchemy, and constructed forges and furnaces. His once pure thirst for knowledge began to metastasize into a desire for domination. He no longer sought to merely understand the devices of Sauron. He sought to surpass them. By the time the council finally took action against Dol Guldur in TA 294-1, Saruman's duplicity was already taking root. The council, led by Galadriel and Elrond, successfully drove Sauron out of his fortress in southern Mirkwood. But Saruman knew that Sauron had not been destroyed, only moved. The enemy returned to Mordor, and the war began to accelerate. Still, Saruman continued to insist that the One Ring was lost forever, dissuading further searches while secretly pursuing the ring himself. The irony of Saruman's strategy is that he had the opportunity to be everything the council needed: a unifying force, a warrior of wisdom, a protector of the free peoples. But in choosing to withhold truth, in choosing to place his own ambitions above his mission, he sowed the seeds of ruin. While Gandalf was building friendships with hobbits and Dúnedain, Saruman was constructing walls, forging weapons, and dreaming of conquest. Even his voice, once an instrument of counsel, became a weapon of manipulation. Saruman possessed the gift of persuasive speech so potent that even the strongest minds could be swayed by him. Many who entered Orthanc left believing that Saruman alone held the keys to peace. He used this power to veil his true intentions, bending wills while smiling with the mask of benevolence. And yet, despite all his planning, Saruman never fully accounted for one factor: Gandalf. Gandalf remained a thorn in his side, a quiet reminder of the mission they were meant to uphold. Saruman envied him, feared his growing influence, and began to suspect that Gandalf had discovered more than he let on. When Gandalf was given Narya, the elven ring of fire, by Círdan the shipwright, it only deepened Saruman's paranoia. The ring was a symbol of trust, and Saruman had not been chosen to bear one. Thus, the leader of the White Council found himself isolated by his own ambition. His efforts to dominate the future had begun to isolate him from the very allies he was supposed to lead. The rise of the White Wizard had reached its peak, but it was a hollow triumph. He sat at the head of the council, but his heart no longer belonged to it. He wore the white robes of wisdom, but they cloaked a soul slipping deeper into darkness. Saruman's rise was not marked by thunder or betrayal. It was quiet, gradual, and almost imperceptible to those around him. But it was real. The White Wizard had become a man who no longer sought to guide Middle-earth to safety. He sought to rule it, and in doing so, he set himself on a path from which there would be no return. Though Saruman had once been the wisest of the Istari, and a paragon of knowledge, sent to guide the peoples of Middle-earth, his gradual descent into corruption was neither sudden nor impulsive. It was a long and deliberate fall, fueled not by rage or fear, but by pride, envy, and a fatal overconfidence in his own wisdom. And at the heart of this transformation was one object, the most potent and perilous artifact ever forged in Arda, the One Ring. Saruman's obsession with the ring began subtly. As the head of the White Council, he was tasked with gathering and disseminating knowledge to help combat the resurgence of Sauron. In that role, he naturally took a deep interest in the history of the Rings of Power. He became the foremost scholar in Middle-earth on their crafting, their abilities, and the terrible power imbued in the One Ring. Initially, this was just part of his mission, but over time, the lines between duty and desire began to blur. To understand Saruman's descent, one must understand the allure of the ring itself. The One Ring was not merely an object of power, it was a vessel of domination. Forged by Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom, it was made to control all the other rings of power, and through them, their bearers. It whispered to its wielder promises of greatness, of conquest, of unassailable strength. Even those who had never laid eyes on the ring could feel its pull through legend and imagination. Saruman, steeped in knowledge, found his thoughts returning to it again and again, though he publicly maintained that the ring had been lost, likely destroyed or buried forever beneath the earth or the sea. In truth, Saruman believed otherwise. Secretly, he was convinced that the ring had survived. And more than that, he believed that he alone had the intellect, the strength and the clarity of purpose to wield it safely. Where others would fall, he told himself, he would stand. Where Sauron had corrupted, he would restore. It was not arrogance in the conventional sense, it was a profound and deadly self-deception. He began to study not only the lore of the elves and Númenóreans, but the very mechanisms by which Sauron had created the ring. His research became increasingly technical and disturbingly sympathetic. He constructed his own forges beneath Isengard. He bred strange beasts, warped orcs, and began to experiment with the kinds of domination the ring had made possible. He no longer studied Sauron to defeat him. He studied him to replace him. It is here that Saruman crossed a subtle but irreversible threshold. He came to believe that the enemy's methods were not inherently evil. They were simply tools, misused by a malevolent will. In Saruman's eyes, domination, control, manipulation, these were not sins, they were strategies, and like any strategy, they could be used for good if employed by the right hand, his hand. This ideology, this rationalization of evil, for the sake of a greater good, is what separates Saruman's fall from the more overt corruption of figures like the Nazgûl. He was not enslaved by fear or by torture, he was corrupted by his own reason. He believed in the illusion of control, that he could wield darkness without being consumed by it, that he could find the ring, take it for himself, and rebuild the world into a better, more ordered place. But while Saruman delved into the ring's secrets, he was not the only one searching for it. Sauron too had begun to move in earnest. His power was growing in Mordor. Barad-dûr rose again, and he, like Saruman, sought the One Ring above all else. To Sauron, the ring was not only a weapon, it was a piece of himself, a fraction of his very soul. And now, with it missing from his grasp, he was desperate to recover it. He poured his will into finding it, and began corrupting minds, setting traps, and sending his servants across Middle-earth. Somehow, Saruman still believed he could outwit him. At this point, Saruman made what might have been his most dangerous decision yet. He began to use the Palantir, an ancient seeing stone recovered from Orthanc. These stones were created in the days of Númenor, and allowed their users to communicate or perceive distant events. But the Palantiri were dangerous. They could be misleading. They revealed only what they wished, or what the stronger will behind the stone allowed. And Sauron, having taken control of one of the stones in Barad-dûr, was now capable of bending other users to his will. It is not entirely clear when Saruman first made contact with Sauron through the Palantir, but it is clear that the contact changed him. Whether he believed he was still in control, or whether he truly bent the knee in secret, remains a mystery. Some believe that Saruman pretended to serve Sauron in hopes of betraying him later. Others suggest he was wholly ensnared by the Dark Lord's power. What is clear is that from this point forward, Saruman's actions no longer reflected a desire to fight evil, they reflected a desire to seize it. He no longer viewed the peoples of Middle-earth as allies. He saw them as tools. He began to spy on the Shire, believing that the hobbits, insignificant as they seemed, might hold a clue to the ring's whereabouts. He sent agents to Bree. He dispatched spies and birds. He even manipulated Radagast the Brown, using the trust of his fellow wizard to lure Gandalf into a trap. When Gandalf visited Isengard, Saruman revealed his true intentions. Gone were the pretense and masks. Saruman spoke openly of his plan to find the ring and use it, not destroy it. He invited Gandalf to join him, to create a new order, a union of wise and powerful beings that would bring order to the chaos of Middle-earth. But Gandalf refused, and so Saruman imprisoned him. This act was not merely a political betrayal, it was a spiritual one. Saruman had fully rejected the purpose of the Istari. He had chosen ambition over duty, domination over guidance. The seduction of the ring had consumed him, even though he had never touched it. His very will was now shaped by the ring's promise, his mind ensnared by its possibility. He had become a shadow of the thing he once stood against. Worse still, Saruman deluded himself into believing he was still the master of his own fate, that he could serve Sauron temporarily, then rise against him, that he could deceive the deceiver. But in reality, the very tools he used, the Palantir, the voice, the machines of war, were all echoes of Sauron's design. The more he embraced them, the more he became an extension of the enemy's will. By the time he began constructing an army of Uruk-hai, twisted hybrids bred for war and daylight, Saruman had crossed the final line. These were not defensive forces, these were the seeds of conquest. He armed them with blades marked with the White Hand, a symbol of his own supremacy. He was not merely preparing to challenge Sauron, he was preparing to conquer Middle-earth for himself. And yet, for all his power, all his intelligence, Saruman failed to see the ultimate truth, that the One Ring was not his to command. It had a will of its own, it sought its master. And though Saruman schemed and plotted, he was always one step behind. While he scoured the wilderness with orcs and spies, the ring had already found its way into the hands of a simple hobbit. Thus, the seduction of power, the slow, steady unraveling of Saruman the White, was nearly complete. He no longer remembered his purpose. He no longer saw the difference between guiding and ruling. He no longer believed in free will, or in hope, or in the strength of the weak. He believed only in domination, in knowledge as a weapon, and in the power of the One Ring. He would not be the last to make this mistake, but he was the first of the Istari to fall. By the middle of the Third Age, the Tower of Orthanc had stood for thousands of years, an untouched relic of the ancient Númenórean world. Towering in jet-black stone, seamless and unbreakable, it rose from the center of a verdant circular vale, surrounded by a ring of stone, Isengard. For centuries, it had been abandoned, a silent monument to the greatness of the past. But when Saruman the White was granted guardianship over the tower, that silence was broken. What began as a refuge for study and wisdom gradually transformed into a symbol of industrial might and tyrannical ambition. This was the beginning of the industrialization of Orthanc, and the transformation of Isengard into a war machine. When Saruman took up residence in Orthanc, it seemed a reasonable and even wise choice. The steward of Gondor allowed it, trusting Saruman's reputation as the chief of the White Council. At first, the wizard used the tower as a seat of knowledge, housing countless scrolls, elvish texts, Númenórean relics, and arcane artifacts. He presented himself as a learned scholar, a protector of ancient wisdom. Yet even then, his intentions were already diverging from his mission. Saruman chose Isengard for more than its isolation and historical significance. It was strategic. The tower was perfectly situated near the Gap of Rohan, at the crossroads of major routes between the west and the south. It had access to water via the river Isen, and was shielded by mountains on multiple sides. More importantly, Orthanc was impregnable. No force of men or elves could bring it down. In the mind of Saruman, it was the ideal fortress from which to rule. As Saruman's obsession with the One Ring grew, so too did his ambitions for Isengard. What began as a center of study slowly evolved into a bastion of power. The once green circle around Orthanc, filled with gardens, groves, and streams, was gradually desecrated. Trees were felled in droves, streams redirected, and the very land was scarred to make way for furnaces, forges, and workshops. Smoke began to rise from the vale. The ground blackened. The waters ran thick with waste. Saruman's transformation of Isengard mirrored the corruption of his own soul. The harmony of nature and knowledge was abandoned in favor of efficiency, production, and war. The great ring wall that encircled the vale was fortified and armed. Massive gates were installed. Deep pits were dug into the earth, from which fire and steam rose. The singing of birds and the rustle of leaves gave way to the clang of iron and the roar of engines. He began to create weapons, swords, spears, armor, designed not for defense, but for conquest. He studied metallurgy and blacksmithing, not to emulate Allah's love of creation, but to forge instruments of domination. Saruman was not simply preparing for war, he was redefining it. The old ways, honor, valor, resistance, meant nothing to him now. He wanted an army that would obey without question, fight without fear, and multiply like machines. To this end, he turned to breeding. Saruman began experimenting with orcs, goblins, and men. The result of these dark experiments was the Uruk-hai, a new breed of orc that was faster, stronger, and most importantly, able to withstand sunlight. Traditional orcs hated the sun, and were weakened by it. But the Uruk-hai marched under its gaze with impunity. Saruman had achieved something terrible. He had created an army that could fight day or night, across mountains, plains, and forests, without rest or remorse. The Uruk-hai were bred in pits beneath Isengard, in writhing slime and filth. They emerged fully formed, armored, and armed. They bore the symbol of the white hand of Saruman, a cruel mockery of the white robes he once wore. The white hand was stamped on shields, banners, and helmets. It was not the hand of healing or guidance, it was the hand of domination. Saruman enforced strict control over his growing military state. He used fear and authority to manage his servants. Men who flocked to him, seduced by promises of power, wealth, or protection, were put to work forging weapons, feeding the fires, and spreading propaganda. Orcs were commanded by lieutenants like Ogluk and Lurtz, savage creatures whose loyalty was bought by the promise of slaughter and spoils. From Isengard, Saruman dispatched spies across Middle-earth. Crebain, large, intelligent crows, were trained to act as his eyes. Bands of orcs roamed the land in secrecy. Men loyal to him infiltrated Rohan and the surrounding regions. He built networks of surveillance and influence, always under the guise of neutrality. To the outside world, Saruman was still the White Wizard. Only a few, like Gandalf and Treebeard, saw the truth of what Isengard had become. The Dunedain, elves, and free peoples began to suspect that something was amiss, but Saruman's rhetoric remained smooth. He claimed his forges were for protection, his army a safeguard against Sauron's rise. And indeed, Saruman still spoke of resisting Sauron. He never openly declared allegiance. He hid behind ambiguity, playing both sides, waiting for the ring to reveal itself, so that he could seize power at the moment of maximum advantage. What Saruman failed to realize was that his actions were already echoing those of Sauron. In transforming Isengard into a machine of war, in enslaving the natural world to feed his ambitions, Saruman had ceased to be a guardian of Middle-earth and become its exploiter. His machines tore up the forests of Fangorn. His forges blackened the skies. His lust for power consumed not only himself, but the land itself. This desecration did not go unnoticed. One ancient being, older than the elves, older than Sauron himself, began to stir. Treebeard, the eldest of the Ents, shepherd of the forest, had long remained neutral in the wars of men and elves. But the destruction of Fangorn roused him. Trees that had stood for centuries were cut down and burned as fuel for Saruman's furnaces. The Ents, though slow to anger, never forgot an injury. Saruman had awakened a force he could not understand, one that would come to doom him. Still, at the height of its power, Isengard was terrifying. The great gates were barred, the ring wall was armed. The tower of Orthanc stood untouched by blade or fire. Thousands of Uruk-hai waited below, ready to march. Saruman believed he was unassailable, that from Isengard he would claim the ring, defeat Sauron, and rule Middle-earth as a new kind of Dark Lord, cold, calculated, and mechanical. In his pride he declared himself Saruman of many colors, casting aside the white robes of his order. He claimed that white was a base color, one that could be broken and remade. His robes shimmered with all hues, ever-changing, like oil on water. He was no longer a servant of the Valar. He had made himself a power. And yet, for all the walls, the armies, and the machines, Saruman had one fatal flaw. He believed dominion equaled strength. He did not understand the power of friendship, of loyalty, of simplicity. He mocked the hobbits, underestimated Rohan, and ignored the warning signs in his own soul. In building his empire of gears and fire,
he forgot that nature, slow and ancient, would not be dominated forever. In forging Isengard into a mirror of Mordor, Saruman condemned himself to the same fate, to be crushed not just by armies, but by the weight of his own arrogance. Saruman's fall was not marked by a single moment of betrayal, but by a series of deliberate choices, small justifications, subtle ambitions, and quiet compromises that built upon one another until there was nothing left of his original purpose. As the head of the White Council and one of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth, Saruman was not seduced by evil in the conventional sense. He chose it, piece by piece, rationalizing every turn, until treachery no longer felt like treachery. To him it was strategy. By the late Third Age, Sauron had openly declared himself in Mordor. His fortress of Barad-dûr had risen again. The Eye had become a symbol of dread, and fear spread across Gondor, Rohan, and beyond. In response, the Free Peoples turned to their wisest allies, Elrond, Galadriel, Gandalf, and of course Saruman. But where the others spoke of unity and resistance, Saruman began to speak of inevitability. He no longer believed Sauron could be destroyed. He believed the age of men and elves was ending, and a new order would rise. To ensure his survival in this coming order, Saruman sought power not in defiance of Sauron, but alongside him, or even in place of him. He had convinced himself that the only way to defeat the Dark Lord was to master the same tools, the same methods, and ultimately the One Ring itself. But while the council still debated strategy and searched for signs of the enemy's weakness, Saruman had already begun to secretly align himself with Sauron's vision, if not yet with his command. The pivot point came with the Palantir of Orthanc, the Seeing Stone, gifted to Saruman by the stewards of Gondor when he was granted Orthanc, was once a noble device, meant for communication across vast distances. But by this point in history, most of the Palantiri had been lost or corrupted. Sauron had taken control of the one in Barad-dûr and used it to dominate the weaker minds of anyone foolish enough to look into the others. Saruman believed his will was too strong to be bent. But in truth, Sauron had already begun to ensnare him. Whether Saruman's submission was willing or coerced is debated among scholars. But what is known is that through the Palantir, Sauron fed Saruman a twisted version of the future, one in which resistance was futile, and power could only be preserved through obedience or mimicry. The images shown were of despair, inevitable defeat, and a world remade in fire. Saruman took these visions not as a warning, but as prophecy. And rather than warn the White Council, he began to make plans of his own. He told himself he was being pragmatic, that he was merely observing the tides of history and preparing to ride them. But his actions quickly betrayed a darker truth. He began constructing weapons of war, raising armies of Uruk-hai, and establishing secret alliances with men from the east and south, those already swayed by Sauron's power. He sent out spies, hunted for the ring, and kept vital knowledge from his fellow council members. When Gandalf urged an expedition to destroy Dol Guldur, Saruman delayed and distracted. He wanted Sauron to move, to expose himself, so that the ring might resurface. And when Gandalf persisted, Saruman took more direct action. The trap at Orthanc marked the point of no return. In TA 3018, Gandalf traveled to Isengard to seek Saruman's counsel about the ring, which had finally resurfaced in the Shire. But instead of aid, he found betrayal. Saruman revealed the truth. He no longer served the White Council. He now sought the ring for himself. He offered Gandalf a place at his side, not as a servant of Sauron, but as a partner in a new order, with Saruman as the architect. This was not mere madness, it was a calculated plan. Saruman believed that if he could gain Gandalf's support, they could either wrest the ring from Sauron, or dominate him with it. But Gandalf refused, horrified at what his once noble peer had become. Enraged, Saruman imprisoned him atop the Tower of Orthanc. It was no longer a tower of wisdom, it had become a prison of pride. From this point on, Saruman was no longer playing both sides. He had committed to his betrayal. He had severed his ties to the White Council, imprisoned its most trusted member, and unleashed his armies upon the free peoples of Middle-earth. He was now a Dark Lord in all but name. His first major act of treachery came against the land of Rohan. Knowing that Rohan stood between Isengard and Gondor, and thus between him and any chance of claiming the ring, Saruman began a campaign of subterfuge and destruction. He sent his servant Grima Wormtongue to infiltrate the court of King Theoden. There Grima whispered lies and poisons, weakening the king's will and isolating him from his allies. Under Grima's influence, Rohan was paralyzed, unable to muster its strength even as Saruman's armies massed on its borders. But Saruman did not stop at subterfuge. He unleashed direct war. Orcs, Uruk-hai, and wild men from Dunland raided the Westfold, burning villages and slaughtering civilians. His armies marched across the plains with brutal efficiency. His goal was not simply conquest, it was elimination. He intended to destroy Rohan, and in doing so, cut Gondor off from its allies. The path to dominance would then lie open. All of this was done not under Sauron's command but parallel to it. Saruman still believed he could seize the ring before Sauron did. He had learned from the Palantir that a creature named Gollum had once possessed it, and that it had surfaced in the hands of a hobbit. Saruman sent his own hunters to intercept it, competing with Sauron's Nazgul. In his arrogance, he believed he was outwitting both his enemies and his supposed master. But Saruman's treachery was already unraveling. Gandalf escaped from Orthanc with the aid of Gwaihir, the Lord of the Eagles. He warned the free peoples of Saruman's betrayal. The White Council was effectively broken, and Rohan rallied under Theoden once more. The wizard's betrayal had been revealed, but still, Saruman pressed forward. The Battle of Helm's Deep was to be his moment of triumph. His Uruk-hai army, bred for speed and strength, marched swiftly across the plains, equipped with siege ladders, explosives, and unrelenting discipline. But there in the deep of night, his forces met not only the Rohirrim and their allies, but a vengeful Gandalf, returned as Gandalf the White. With him came Eomer, the banished son of Eomund, leading a cavalry charge that shattered Saruman's army. At the same time, Saruman's desecration of Fangorn Forest had roused an ancient power, the Ents. Under the leadership of Treebeard, the Ents marched on Isengard, in what would become known as the Last March of the Ents. Saruman had not foreseen this. In his calculations, he had accounted for armies and kings, but not for the wrath of trees. While his attention was fixed on Rohan, the Ents destroyed Isengard, flooding the valley, tearing down his machines, and trapping him in the Tower of Orthanc. Thus the arc of his treachery was complete. Saruman's once the White Wizard and leader of the free peoples, now stood imprisoned in his own fortress, powerless to affect the world he once sought to rule. His armies were broken, his alliances scattered, and the ring, the object of all his ambition, had slipped completely through his fingers. In the end, Saruman's betrayal was not just of others, it was of his very self. He had betrayed his mission as an emissary of the Valar. He had betrayed his fellow Istari. He had betrayed the peoples of Middle-earth, who looked to him for wisdom and guidance. And ultimately, he had betrayed his own soul, trading purpose for power, and wisdom for pride. He had tried to become Sauron's rival. In the end, he became his pawn. After centuries of quiet influence and manipulation, Saruman abandoned subtlety and chose war. No longer content to scheme from the shadows, he turned his full attention to the kingdom of Rohan, a vital bulwark of men nestled in the grassy plains between Isengard and Gondor. For Saruman, conquering Rohan was not merely a strategic necessity, it was a stepping stone to greater domination. By crushing the Rohirrim, he could isolate Gondor, seize control of the Westfold, and position himself to challenge Sauron, or perhaps replace him entirely. Saruman's war against Rohan was planned with the cold precision of a tyrant, and the ruthless logic of one who saw people not as souls but as variables to be managed or eliminated. While he cloaked his betrayal of the White Council in philosophical justifications, there was nothing ambiguous about his intentions toward Rohan. He sought to destroy it, its people, its culture, its resistance. In his vision of a new world, the Rittermark had no place. The worm in the court, Saruman's first assault on Rohan, was not military, it was psychological. Before sending armies, he sent a worm, a whispering servant to hollow out the kingdom from within. That worm was Grima Wormtongue, once a man of Rohan, now twisted by fear and greed. Saruman promised Grima power, riches and dominion, in exchange for betrayal. Planted within the golden hall of Meduseld, Grima whispered poison into the ear of King Theoden, weakening the old king's spirit, isolating him from his advisors, and feeding him lies about the strength of his kingdom and the loyalty of his kin. Theoden, once a proud and noble ruler, became a frail and diminished figure, racked by despair, seemingly aged beyond his years. He sat slumped on his throne, his judgment clouded, his warriors dismissed, his armies inactive. Under Grima's manipulation, Rohan became paralyzed, riders were recalled, fortresses abandoned, borders weakened. This strategy nearly succeeded. With Theoden subdued, Rohan stood like a wounded animal before the hungry wolf of Isengard. But Saruman underestimated the resilience of the Rohan, and the arrival of Gandalf the White, newly resurrected, and more powerful than ever. Gandalf exposed Grima's treachery, broke the spell of despair over Theoden, and rallied the kingdom to stand against Saruman's coming storm. Rohan awoke, the Westfold burns. While Saruman had relied on deception and subversion within Meduseld, he had also been gathering a real army beneath Isengard. In the dark pits of his forges, Uruk-hai were bred, stronger, faster, and more disciplined than traditional orcs. These creatures obeyed without question, and marched without fatigue. Saruman's army grew by the thousands, and when the time was right, he unleashed them. His campaign began with raids across the Westfold, the western region of Rohan closest to Isengard. Villages were sacked, men were slain. Women and children were driven from their homes or killed outright. The attackers were not only Uruk-hai but wild men from Dunland, long resentful of the Rohan, and easily manipulated by promises of revenge and reward. Saruman stirred this hatred like a bellows, forging it into a weapon of chaos. Entire settlements were burned to the ground. Refugees streamed toward Adoras. The king's riders, too few and too scattered, struggled to defend their people. The scale of destruction was immense. The once idyllic plains of Rohan, with their rolling hills and wind-swept grasslands, were now marred by fire and blood. Saruman was not merely waging war, he was enacting a form of cultural genocide, aiming to erase the riders of Rohan from history. The death of Theodred, King Theoden's only son and heir, marked a devastating blow. Theodred fell in battle at the fords of Uzun, a strategic crossing where Saruman's forces launched a surprise assault. Without his leadership, morale among the Rohan began to falter. Saruman believed he had delivered the killing strike, Helm's Deep, the fortress of last hope. With his army growing and Rohan reeling, Saruman turned his eyes toward total conquest. His ultimate target was the stronghold of Helm's Deep, a fortress nestled in the White Mountains that had never fallen to enemy hands. If he could take it, the backbone of Rohan would be broken. Saruman sent his full force, 10,000 Uruk-hai, bred and armed in the bowels of Isengard, bearing the white hand of their master. They marched under cover of darkness and storm, across the plains, toward the Deeping Combe. They were joined by men from Dunland and war beasts from the wild. Saruman's war machine had reached its zenith, but Rohan did not fall as easily as he believed. King Theoden, now restored to clarity by Gandalf, led his people into the fortress. The civilians, elders, children, non-combatants, were hidden within the glittering caves of Aglarond. The warriors took to the walls. With them were Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, the fellowship's representatives of men, elves, and dwarves. They stood shoulder to shoulder with the Rohan, ready to defy annihilation. The Battle of Helm's Deep, was one of the greatest sieges in the history of the Third Age. Saruman's forces brought siege ladders, grappling hooks, and even explosives, a horrifying innovation for Middle-earth. The causeway was stormed, the outer wall blasted open, and the defenders were nearly overwhelmed. It seemed Saruman would finally succeed. But then came the dawn. At first light on the third day, Gandalf returned, leading Éomer and thousands of Rohan reinforcements. They charged down the slopes and into Saruman's army from the rear, breaking the siege. At the same moment, the defenders of Helm's Deep surged forward in one final push. Caught between hammer and anvil, the Uruk-hai were slaughtered. The battle was over. Saruman had failed. The fall of Isengard. Even as his army was being broken in Rohan, Saruman's other great oversight returned to haunt him. Fangorn Forest. Saruman had raised its borders for fuel, chopping ancient trees to feed his forges. But he had not accounted for the Ents tree shepherds, sentient beings older than Sauron himself. Treebeard, the eldest of them, had long remained neutral in the affairs of the world. But when he learned of Saruman's desecration, he rallied his kin. The Ents marched on Isengard, their fury slow building but unstoppable. They tore through the gates, crushed the walls, and flooded the forges with the waters of the river Isen. The once mighty industrial stronghold was reduced to ruin. Saruman, trapped in the tower of Orthanc, could only watch as his empire burned. His war was over. The cost of hubris. Saruman's campaign against Rohan revealed not only his military ambition, but his arrogant blindness. He had underestimated the bonds of friendship, the resilience of free peoples, and the latent strength of those he deemed beneath him. He saw the Rohirrim as primitive horse lords, easily crushed. He saw Theoden as a dying man. He saw Gandalf as an equal at best. He was wrong on all counts. In the end, the war on Rohan did not just fail, it broke Saruman. With his armies destroyed, his stronghold ruined, and his reputation shattered, he was reduced to a prisoner in his own tower, stripped of allies, denied even the dignity of death in battle. And yet, even then, Saruman clung to bitterness, to the belief that he had been wronged, not outwitted. His downfall would continue beyond the battlefield, as we will soon see. But in the war on Rohan, the mask of the wise wizard was finally torn away, revealing what Saruman had become, not a savior of the world, but a tyrant who nearly helped destroy it. The story of Saruman's downfall cannot be told without understanding the ascension of Gandalf. The two wizards, once peers and members of the same divine order, became opposing forces, mirrors of what each might have been. As Saruman fell deeper into corruption, consumed by pride and the lust for power, Gandalf rose in wisdom, humility, and grace. When Saruman became a traitor to his mission, Gandalf was reborn, not only in spirit, but in stature. His transformation into Gandalf the White marked a profound shift in the balance of power in Middle-earth, and in the spiritual hierarchy of the Istari. The death and rebirth of Mithrandir. To understand the weight of Gandalf's rise, we must revisit his fall. In the dark depths of Moria, while leading the Fellowship through the ancient dwarven halls, Gandalf faced the Balrog of Morgoth, a being of fire and shadow, one of the ancient Maia who had followed Morgoth in the First Age. The duel between the two was not simply a battle of fire and sword, it was a clash of divine wills. Gandalf cast down the Balrog, but perished in the process. Yet this death was not the end. Gandalf's spirit returned beyond thought and time, and he was sent back to Middle-earth by the authority of the Valar, and perhaps even Eru Ilúvatar himself. He had fulfilled his purpose as Gandalf the Grey, and was now reborn with greater clarity, power and authority, as Gandalf the White. This was not merely a cosmetic transformation. Gandalf's rebirth represented a cosmic reordering. Saruman, once the White, had forfeited his role. In betraying the free peoples and embracing domination, Saruman had been removed from his position. The mantle of leadership among the Istari had passed to Gandalf. His new robes were white, not as a symbol of purity, but of purpose. He now bore the authority once granted to Saruman, and with it came the burden of leadership in the final struggle against Sauron. And unlike Saruman, Gandalf never sought power for himself. He remained a guide, not a ruler, a steward of hope rather than a tyrant of order. The confrontation at Isengard, the most literal and symbolic confrontation between Saruman and Gandalf, occurred after the fall of Isengard, when the Ents, led by Treebeard, had reduced Saruman's stronghold to ruin and imprisoned him within Orthanc. It was here, in the aftermath of war, that Gandalf arrived with Théoden, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli to confront the fallen wizard. Saruman, still cloistered within the tower, retained his eloquence and his formidable voice. From a balcony high above, he addressed the party, weaving honeyed words and veiled threats. He tried to persuade Théoden, belittle Gandalf, and cast doubt into the hearts of the visitors. Saruman's voice had long been a tool of manipulation. Even when his deeds had been exposed, he believed he could still control the minds of others, and for a moment, even Théoden was almost swayed. That was the depth of Saruman's power, his ability to sound reasonable while plotting ruin. But this time, Saruman's voice failed him. Gandalf, now the White, was no longer Saruman's equal. He spoke with greater authority, with a will that could not be manipulated. And in that moment, he revealed the truth of his transformation. Gandalf demanded that Saruman come down and be judged. Saruman refused. He still clung to the illusion of superiority, still imagined himself a master among lesser beings. But Gandalf would no longer indulge the lie. With calm but unmistakable power, Gandalf cast Saruman out of the Order of the Istari. His staff shattered in his hand. His voice, though still smooth, had lost its magic. His white robes were now just cloth, symbols without substance. In that instant, Saruman became just a man. A Maia in exile, a spirit severed from its divine purpose. It was a staggering reversal of fortune. Once, Gandalf had deferred to Saruman in the White Council. Now, he stood in judgment. The tower that had symbolized Saruman's dominance was now his prison. The mantle of leadership had passed. The shift in power, the shift between Saruman and Gandalf, was more than personal. It represented a broader spiritual realignment in Middle-earth. The Valar had sent 5 Istari to guide the world, not to rule it. Saruman, in his pride, had twisted that mission. Gandalf, through sacrifice, humility and compassion, fulfilled it. He had never built an army, never claimed a throne, never raised a banner.
Easy.
And yet his influence was now greater than any king's. He had earned the trust of the free peoples, not through domination, but by walking among them, sharing in their sufferings, lifting their burdens, and guiding them without command. In this new role, Gandalf took on the work Saruman had abandoned. He became the chief strategist of the War of the Ring. He united Rohan and Gondor, inspired resistance in the face of overwhelming darkness, and ultimately enabled Frodo and Sam to succeed in their mission to destroy the ring. While Saruman obsessed over the ring, Gandalf trusted in others. While Saruman sought control, Gandalf inspired freedom. It was a complete inversion of their paths. This is the essence of the shift in power. The white was once a color of superiority, of intellect, of authority. In Gandalf's hands, it became a color of service, sacrifice, and faith. The very qualities Saruman dismissed as weakness became the pillars of true strength. The aftermath, for Saruman stripped of power and locked in his tower, Saruman was left to rot. Treebeard guarded him, ensuring he could not flee. But Saruman, ever cunning, retained his voice, and he used it to manipulate Grima Wormtongue, who remained his only follower. Eventually, Saruman was released, not out of mercy, but because Gandalf, now the White, recognized that true power did not require vengeance. He left Saruman to his fate, knowing that the former wizard had already destroyed himself. But Saruman could not let go of his hatred. He slunk away with Grima to the Shire, a place he had long observed from afar, and believed he could easily dominate. It was a petty move, the act of a man who had once dreamed of ruling the world, now reduced to bullying hobbits. His time in the Shire, however, would prove to be his final disgrace. His death at the hands of Grima, in the ruins of Bag End, was inglorious. His spirit was seen fleeing, pale and shriveled, only to be scattered by the west wind, a final sign that he had been denied redemption, a fate unlike Gandalf's own transformation. A Tale of Two Wizards. The rise of Gandalf the White is not merely the story of one wizard's growth, it is the counterpoint to Saruman's collapse. Both began as Maia spirits of great potential. Both served the Valar. Both were sent to Middle-earth as part of the same sacred mission. But while Saruman sought knowledge as a means of power, Gandalf sought it as a means of understanding. While Saruman sought dominion, Gandalf sought peace, and where Saruman feared death, Gandalf passed through it, and returned stronger. The power Gandalf now wielded was not his own. It was granted to him, because he had proven himself a true servant of Eru Iluvatar's vision, a guide, not a tyrant. He became what Saruman was meant to be. In that there is both triumph and tragedy. Gandalf the White was the last hope of the West, not because he was the strongest in magic, or the most brilliant in thought, but because he was the most faithful in spirit. And Saruman, cast down, represented the cautionary tale, that even the greatest among the wise can fall when they value control above compassion, domination above duty, and themselves above the world they were sent to serve. In the vast chronicles of Middle-earth, few events symbolize poetic justice more profoundly than the siege of Isengard. It was not a battle waged by kings or armies, but by the ancient and often overlooked guardians of the forest, the Ents, slow to act but mighty in wrath. The Ents delivered the final blow to Saruman's dreams of conquest. After years of betrayal, deforestation, and spiritual decay, Isengard, the once proud fortress of knowledge, became a prison, a ruin, and a monument to the wizard's prideful fall. Saruman, once Curunír the Maia, and the wisest of the Istari, had over decades transformed Isengard into a fortress of industry. What had once been a green vale full of trees, grass, and streams, was now a scarred pit of black iron, smoke-belching furnaces, and war machines. Trees were chopped down indiscriminately to feed the fires of war. Saruman's Uruk-hai were bred in slime-filled pits beneath Orthanc. He had not only betrayed the White Council, he had declared war on the natural world. But in doing so, he awoke a power he never truly understood. The Ents of Fangorn. The Ents were among the oldest beings in Middle-earth, created at the request of Yavanna, the Vala of growing things, as shepherds of the trees. Towering, thoughtful, and deeply connected to the forest, Ents were slow to move, slow to anger, and bound by a deep sense of time that mortal races could scarcely comprehend. They had watched for millennia as forests were felled and lands changed, but rarely had they intervened in the wars of men and elves. Saruman had always viewed the Ents with disdain, considering them ancient relics, sluggish and inconsequential. His obsession with machinery and order left no room for the unpredictable rhythms of the forest. When he ordered the indiscriminate destruction of Fangorn's trees to fuel his forges, he assumed there would be no consequences. He was wrong. It began with two small figures, Merry and Pippin, hobbits of the Shire, who had escaped captivity from Saruman's Uruk-hai and wandered into Fangorn Forest. There they encountered Treebeard, the oldest of the Ents, possibly even the oldest living creature in Middle-earth. Curious, kind, and slow to judge, Treebeard took them in, and through their conversations, he began to piece together the truth about Saruman's treachery. For the Ents, time moved differently. Decisions that would take seconds for others could take days. And so, Treebeard called an Entmoot, a gathering of the Ents in Dern Dingle, to discuss what should be done about the wizard in Isengard. At first, many Ents were hesitant. Saruman's actions were grievous, but their kind had long avoided involvement in the affairs of the outside world. They were not warriors by nature. But as the Ents listened, observed and remembered the trees that had been felled, the seppies, many of their friends who had been destroyed, they began to shift. Their anger, once distant and latent, began to build. And when the Entmoot ended, the decision was made. They would go to war. The march of the Ents. Few moments in Tolkien's legendarium are as awe-inspiring as the last march of the Ents. From the ancient heart of Fangorn Forest, dozens of Ents emerged, their massive limbs creaking like the boughs of ancient oaks, their voices rising in deep, rumbling chants. They were not clad in armor or wielding swords. They were the weapons. Living trees, older than memory, now moving with grim purpose toward Isengard. Saruman never saw them coming. He had focused all his attention on Rohan, on Helm's Deep, on Theoden, on the Ring. He believed Isengard to be impenetrable, protected by stone walls and machines. But he had not prepared for nature's wrath. The Ents arrived at Isengard and launched their assault without hesitation. With incredible strength, they tore down the gates and ripped apart the outer defenses. Towers crumbled beneath their limbs. The fires of the forges were extinguished under tons of stone and splintered wood. Saruman's carefully constructed machinery, his pride, his power, was smashed like toys beneath the feet of giants. Perhaps the most devastating blow came from the dam they destroyed. Saruman had dammed the river Isen to feed his industrial complex. The Ents broke the dam, and the waters surged into Isengard like a divine flood. The fire pits were drowned. The furnaces hissed and died. The pits where the Uruk-hai had been bred filled with water and mud. The destruction was not chaotic or blind. It was surgical and righteous. The Ents knew what they were doing. They didn't kill indiscriminately, but they left nothing standing that could be used to wage war again. Orthanc itself, made of indestructible black stone, was untouched, but everything around it was reduced to rubble. Within the tower, Saruman watched helplessly. He who had once commanded armies, twisted wills, and defied the White Council, was now a prisoner in his own fortress, trapped, powerless, surrounded not by obedient orcs or terrified men, but by trees who remembered every cut, every fire, every scream of a sapling burned alive. The arrival of Gandalf and the king following the Ents' triumph. Gandalf, now Gandalf the White, arrived at Isengard with Theoden, Aragorn, and other companions. What they found was astonishing. The once feared fortress of Saruman was reduced to a flooded basin, filled with broken machines, charred beams, and drowned pits. Treebeard stood watch at the gates, now the de facto jailer of the wizard he had once viewed with cautious respect. Gandalf's confrontation with Saruman, already explored in detail in a previous section, was made possible by the Ents. Without them, Saruman might have recovered. He might have regrouped, but the Ents had broken the spine of his power, and Gandalf arrived only to officially strip him of his title, his staff, and his authority. Saruman's last hope, his fortress, his war machine, had been undone not by men, not by magic, but by the oldest force in Middle-earth, nature itself. A symbolic reckoning. The siege of Isengard is more than a military event. It is a deeply symbolic moment in the mythology of Middle-earth. Saruman had turned against the natural order. He saw the world as material to be exploited, not stewarded. He dismissed the trees as fuel, the land as raw material, and the old ways as obsolete. His desire to remake the world in his image, to industrialize it, to dominate it, led him to strip the land bare, poison the rivers, and enslave creation. The Ents' retaliation was nature's vengeance, not in the sense of chaos, but in the sense of restoration. The world itself, through its oldest guardians, rejected Saruman's vision. The waters returned, the trees walked, the earth took back what was stolen. It's a powerful commentary on the dangers of hubris, of unchecked industrialism, and of forgetting the value of the natural world. Tolkien, who deeply loved nature, and lamented the destruction caused by modern war and machines, used this moment to show that when power ignores harmony, the world itself will rebel. The aftermath. After the siege, Treebeard and the Ents remained at Isengard, keeping watch over Saruman, now confined to the Tower of Orthanc. The land began to heal, the waters receded, the blackened earth, once thought dead, began to grow green once more. Saruman, once master of Isengard, had become a relic, locked in a tower of his own making. His voice still held some power, and he would use it to manipulate Grima Wormtongue, who remained his pitiful servant. But his days of conquest were over. The siege of Isengard had shattered his myth. The White Hand was broken, the machines were drowned, the fires were out, and Saruman, once feared across the west, was now just a shadow clinging to stone walls. The Ents' fears, having fulfilled their duty, eventually began to fade again into legend. Their march was over, but it would never be forgotten. In the words of Gandalf, they had been rused, and in their wrath, they reminded the world that not all power is forged in steel or fire. Some power grows slowly, like roots beneath the earth, silent, ancient, and impossible to crush forever. If Saruman's armies were broken at Helm's Deep, and his fortress drowned at Isengard, there was still one weapon left in his arsenal: his voice. Long before he raised a sword or bred an army, Saruman was known not only for his wisdom, but for his ability to persuade, manipulate, and dominate through speech alone. It was said that even the wisest could be swayed by his words. His voice, smooth as silk and sharp as steel, had moved kings, twisted councils, and clouded the judgments of great minds. Even after his physical power was shattered, Saruman still believed his voice could save him. He thought words could rebuild what war had ruined. But in truth, his final weapon would prove both ineffective and tragic. What had once made him revered now revealed his madness and spiritual emptiness. The power of Saruman's voice from the very beginning of his time in Middle-earth. Saruman's most defining trait had been his voice. It was not magic in the sense of spells or incantations. It was subtler, more dangerous. His voice was persuasion elevated to an art form, capable of weaving illusions, stirring desires, and manipulating reason itself. He could make lies sound like wisdom, make treachery seem righteous, and lead even the strongest to question their convictions. In Rivendell and Lothlorien, in Gondor and Rohan, Saruman's words had once held sway. As leader of the White Council, he had used his voice to stall action against Sauron, masking his growing obsession with the One Ring. He convinced the council that the ring was lost, and that Dol Guldur did not need immediate attention, all while secretly searching for the ring himself. When he infiltrated Rohan through Grima Wormtongue, it was again through speech, the careful poisoning of Theoden's mind with false comfort and fear. Even in Orthanc, as his plans collapsed, Saruman remained confident in his voice. After all, hadn't it worked before? The confrontation at the tower. After the siege of Isengard, Saruman was trapped in Orthanc. The Ents had destroyed his army and flooded his war machine. He was cornered, but he wasn't silent. When Gandalf, Theoden, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and others arrived to confront him, Saruman emerged onto a balcony near the top of the tower and began to speak. And for a moment, just a moment, it nearly worked. His words were composed, soothing, eloquent. He praised Theoden's strength, acknowledged his own errors, and offered a new beginning. He framed himself, not as an enemy, but as a fellow wise man, who had merely made hard choices in hard times. Even as the waters of Isengard lapped at the foot of the tower, and the wreckage of his ambition smoldered behind him, Saruman spoke as though he still ruled the world. Theoden, already wounded by years of manipulation through Grima, faltered. His hand twitched on his sword. For a heartbeat, it seemed Saruman might win him over again. That was the danger of the voice. It wasn't mere flattery. It bypassed logic, appealed to fear, to pride, to longing. Saruman could make enemies seem like friends. He could make domination sound like salvation. But this time, Saruman miscalculated. He had underestimated the man who stood before him now. Gandalf the White, the shattering of the illusion. Gandalf had once been Saruman's junior in the Order of the Istari. He had deferred to him, respected his leadership, and even admired his knowledge. But that Gandalf was gone. This was no longer Mithrandir the Grey, but a being returned from death, blessed with authority and insight Saruman could no longer comprehend. When Saruman attempted to sway Gandalf with honeyed words and veiled threats, Gandalf's response was cold, sharp, and unshakable. He gave Saruman one last chance to come down from the tower, to abandon the path of pride and face judgment. It was not a cruel offer, but a final opportunity for redemption. Saruman refused. He could not imagine submitting to a former peer. He believed himself still superior, still the rightful master of the Istari, even as the world crumbled beneath him. He retreated back into pride, and with that choice, Gandalf pronounced the sentence. With a gesture and a word, Gandalf broke Saruman's staff, severing him from his magical power. He declared him cast out from the Order of Wizards, stripped of rank and dignity. It was a moment of stunning finality. The voice that had once manipulated kings now echoed hollowly against the stone walls of a ruined tower. Treebeard, watching from below, closed the gates of Isengard, sealing Saruman inside. It was over. No spell, no speech, no force remained to lift Saruman from his fall. The descent into madness. But Saruman's story didn't end at Orthanc. Though defeated, he still clung to pride. He still believed he had been wronged, that the free peoples were fools, that Gandalf had stolen what was rightfully his. His madness was not loud or ranting. It was a cold, bitter delusion, nurtured in silence behind stone walls. His only companion now was Grima Wormtongue, the very man he had once used to weaken Rohan. Grima had no love for Saruman, only fear, dependency, and a broken spirit. The two became mirrors of each other, master and servant, both degraded, both imprisoned by choices they could not reverse. Eventually, Treebeard allowed them to leave. Gandalf, ever merciful, did not demand their death. Saruman was no longer a threat, not in arms, not in mind. He was a relic, a shadow. But even in defeat, Saruman's voice did not fall silent. He traveled north, with Grima, away from the centers of power, away from war. He wandered, bitter and quiet, through lands that once might have welcomed him. Eventually, he arrived at the Shire, the peaceful home of the hobbits, the very place he had once dismissed as insignificant. But Saruman knew of the Shire. He had spied on it for years. He had always suspected it held secrets, secrets like the ring. And now, in his final bitterness, he resolved to corrupt it, to prove that even the most innocent corner of Middle-earth could be warped by his will. The voice in the Shire, Saruman, under the alias Sharky, took control of the Shire through intimidation, manipulation, and imported thugs. He turned it into a gray, joyless, industrialized land, ruled by rules, punishments, and fear. Smoke filled the air. Trees were cut down. Hobbits were enslaved to bureaucracy and petty cruelty. It was his final petty revenge, a mockery of the world he had once dreamed of ruling. He could no longer dominate elves or men, so he crushed flowers and festivals. He could not seize the ring, so he ruined gardens. And still, he used his voice. He cowed local leaders, turned hobbit against hobbit, and wrapped his web of domination around a people who had once been free. But Saruman's tyranny did not last. The hobbits he had once ignored, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, returned from the War of the Ring changed, hardened by battle and filled with purpose. They led a rebellion. The Shire rose, Saruman's final defeat came not at the hands of warriors or wizards, but by the very people he thought too small to matter. The final word cornered in the ruins of Bag End, Saruman still tried to speak. He still thought he could talk his way out, that his voice retained some of its former power. He attempted to sway Frodo with false repentance, and Frodo, in an act of true nobility, refused to take revenge. He told Saruman to leave, offering him mercy one last time. But Grima Wormtongue, finally broken by years of abuse, turned on his master. With a dagger, he slew Saruman from behind. And in that moment, the true nature of Saruman was revealed. His spirit rose, ghostly, pale, and filled with malice, but it was rejected. A cold wind from the west blew it away, scattering it like smoke in the dawn. He had no place among the Valar, no redemption, no return. The voice that had once held sway over kings, that had guided councils and seduced minds, was gone forever. Legacy of a broken voice. Saruman's story is, in many ways, the story of a man who believed he could control the world through speech. He believed that knowledge and persuasion were tools of dominion, that if he spoke well enough, thought deeply enough, or planned cleverly enough, he could bend history to his will. But in the end, his voice became his prison. He talked when he should have listened. He deceived when he should have guided. He demanded when he should have served. And so, the last true power he possessed, his voice became nothing more than a whisper in the wind. Saruman's journey began in light and wisdom, as Curumo, a Maia of Ola, sent by the Valar to Middle-earth to guide its peoples in their time of greatest need. He was chosen first among the Istari, adorned in white to reflect his authority and purity of purpose. But by the end of the Third Age, he was no longer a figure of greatness. He was a ghost of himself, a bitter exile, a schemer without followers, and ultimately a cautionary tale. His death, unceremonious and ignoble, served as the final punctuation in a story of gradual corruption. But it is in his legacy, in what his fall represents, that Saruman's tale finds lasting meaning. The final fall, from tower to alley. After his power was broken at Isengard, and his voice stripped of authority, Saruman was permitted to leave the confines of Orthanc. Treebeard, moved by Gandalf's advice and perhaps his own ancient sense of pity, allowed the fallen wizard to walk free. But Saruman had no power, no army, and no allies. Even Gandalf, now the White, regarded him with a kind of grim mercy, not as a threat, but as a defeated spirit no longer worth fighting. He left with Grima Wormtongue, his last remaining servant, though even this relationship was poisoned by abuse and fear. Together, they wandered northward through lands they once sought to dominate. Towns turned them away, travelers ignored them. Saruman, once the chief of the White Council and master of Isengard, became a beggar in rags, clinging to remnants of influence that no longer existed. Eventually, the pair made their way to the Shire. It was here that Saruman launched his final petty campaign, an attempt not to conquer a great kingdom or seize the ring, but to ruin something beautiful. He had long watched the Shire from afar, using spies and agents like Lotho Sackville Baggins to gather information and influence. The hobbits had once seemed beneath his notice, small, cheerful creatures with no armies or magic. But now, in his bitterness, they became the perfect target. Sharky in the Shire. Saruman arrived in the Shire, under the alias Sarki, a name likely derived from the Orcish Sharku, meaning old man. He took control of what had been a peaceful, self-sufficient society, and twisted it into a grey reflection of Isengard. Lotho, who had foolishly attempted to industrialize the Shire for personal gain, was quickly cast aside, likely murdered on Saruman's orders. From there, the wizard ruled through fear and manipulation, turning the Shire into a place unrecognizable to its own people. Under Sharky's rule, trees were cut, rivers were fouled, mills were built, and hobbits were forced into labor. Homes were destroyed and replaced with bleak, regimented housing. Music and laughter were outlawed. Visitors were monitored. A network of thugs enforced curfews and punished dissent. It was not the grand tyranny Saruman had once envisioned, but a petty dictatorship, fueled by revenge, not vision. His dominion over the Shire wasn't about strategy, it was spite. He couldn't build anymore, only destroy. And yet even this last kingdom would not stand. The scouring of the Shire, when Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin returned from the War of the Ring, they found their homeland transformed. But they had changed too. No longer the naive hobbits who once left Bag End, they were now seasoned warriors and leaders. They swiftly organized a resistance, rallied the people, and liberated the Shire, in what became known as the Scouring of the Shire. Saruman's power in this final stronghold crumbled within days. His hired enforcers were routed, his machinery was dismantled. The hobbits took back their land, street by street, garden by garden. He was left with nothing, no troops, no servants, no weapons, no pride. In the end, Saruman was confronted by Frodo at the very doorstep of Bag End, the home he had defiled. Still he spoke, still he tried to wound with words. He mocked Frodo, threatened him. But Frodo, having seen the darkness of Mordor, had grown past fear or anger. Instead of executing Saruman, Frodo offered him mercy, one final chance to leave, to walk away, to end the cycle of harm. This act of grace was something Saruman could not comprehend. It was not weakness, it was strength. But to Saruman, shaped by power and control, such kindness only deepened his hatred. And then the final betrayal came, not from Frodo, but from Grima Wormtongue. Years of humiliation, abuse and subjugation finally exploded into violence. In a fit of rage, Grima stabbed Saruman in the back, slaying him in the mud of the Shire. It was a pathetic death, not on a battlefield, not in a duel, but in filth and bitterness, slain by the very servant he had destroyed. Saruman's spirit rose, pale and twisted, seeking the west, perhaps hoping for redemption or return. But a cold wind from the undying lands blew it away, dispersing it like smoke. He was not welcomed, he was not forgiven, he vanished, leaving behind only a broken body and a deeper silence. What Saruman became in death, Saruman left behind no legacy of buildings, no heirs, no songs sung in his name. The Tower of Orthanc remained, but it was reclaimed by the stewards of Gondor. Isengard, once blackened and defiled, began to bloom again under the care of the Ents. The scars faded. The memory of Sharky lingered only as a bad dream. There was no tomb, no monument. He had been the most powerful of the Istari, the head of the White Council, the one trusted above all others. But his choices led him down a path of domination, deceit, and ultimately self-destruction. Saruman became a tragic archetype, the wise corrupted by their own belief in superiority. He is a warning that even the brightest minds can fall when they value control above service, when they trade humility for arrogance, and when they seek to reshape the world according to their own will rather than understand it. His story mirrors others in Tolkien's world: Feanor, who unleashed the doom of the elves; Boromir, who tried to take the ring; and even Gollum, who once had a chance to turn back. All are defined not by the darkness around them, but by their response to it. Saruman had countless chances to change his path. He refused them all. The true lesson of Saruman's fall. Tolkien, ever the subtle moralist, wove Saruman's arc with layers of meaning. Beyond the narrative, there is a deeper truth. Saruman's fall shows us that evil often does not appear evil at first. It begins in compromise, in reasoning, in pragmatism. Saruman didn't wake up one day and decide to betray the free peoples. He talked himself into it, convinced himself it was necessary, that only he could understand the path forward. His pride was not loud, it was insidious. He did not love destruction.
Whoa.
He simply thought order mattered more than freedom, that efficiency mattered more than life, that he mattered more than the world. This is why his death in the Shire matters so much. It brings his story full circle. The mighty wizard brought low, not by an army, but by a servant. Not in a fortress, but in a village. Not for glory, but for small senseless hatred. His death is a lesson not just for Middle-earth, but for any age. That wisdom without humility leads to ruin. That knowledge without compassion becomes tyranny. That the desire to dominate, even in the name of good, corrupts absolutely. Echoes in the world beyond. Though Saruman perished, his shadow remains in the history of Middle-earth. The scars he left on Isengard, on Rohan, and on the Shire served as reminders that even the most beloved institutions can fall, if not guarded by moral strength. But he also served another purpose. His fall helped elevate those around him. Gandalf rose to his true potential. The hobbits found their courage. The free people saw the price of complacency. Saruman in the end did not defeat the world, but he revealed its strength.